Hey everyone, welcome back. So I've got another recipe for you guys for the 3.5 liter 2GR-FE, 350 wheel horsepower, naturally aspirated, pump gas, no machine work, stock ECU for you guys this time. Let's not hang on to anything till the end. Roll the dyno. And the numbers? Check it out. 354 wheel horsepower. Yeah, it goes about as good as it looks too. Yeah, so let's put that in perspective a little bit actually. Let's start by comparing it to what we call the stock MR2 configuration, right? Toyota never made any of these, but if you bolted in and used the normal swap parts, so, you know, the headers, the exhaust and everything, you end up with a pretty free-flowing intake and a free-flowing exhaust. So that leads you usually around 290 wheel horsepower. You can check that out right here. So 60 wheel horsepower gain, honestly, anybody should be pretty happy to see that. But let's get a real sense of perspective here. If this motor was in a Camry, like Toyota installed them to begin with the factory intake, factory exhaust, all that stuff, check out what it makes. About 230 horsepower to the wheels. So yeah, we're looking at over 120 horsepower gained, and we're still naturally aspirated. Yeah. I'm excited about that, even though this is actually not the most naturally aspirated power that I've made. In fact, there's a link up there. You can check that out. That made 405 wheel horsepower. This one was designed to be very much, have good street manners, and the big thing is run on the stock ECU. So the goals for this build were to hit 350 wheel horsepower. And that, after selling some performance parts for a while now, there was a couple things that were obvious. First is most people are allergic to wiring, so for that and the fact that a lot of tuners really struggle with VVTi motors, it needed to run on the stock ECU, and I needed to be able to provide just a canned tune that people could just run. It needed to run on pump gas. Premium was fine, and in this case, that chart you saw there a second ago was done on 93 octane. It needed to avoid any machine work because, well, most people don't have access to it, and some people that even think they have access to it, what they really have access to is shops that know how to build small block Fords and small block Chevys. And this motor, while many things are still in common with those old motors, there's a few critical things that aren't, and I've heard too many nightmare stories, I've seen too many nightmare stories of people getting them remachined and just ending up with absolute junk. So no machine work necessary. And then I wanted to keep the cost as low as possible without sacrificing things. So some of you might kind of get the idea of what this is going to involve here. Spoiler. But in the end, what we ended up doing is replacing the valve springs, specifically a valve spring that does not require a different retainer. Asterisk, some of the 2GRs are actually beehive springs, very few of them, but those will require a retainer. But most of them won't even require a retainer, won't require a keeper to change the spring height. This is a direct drop-in. Of course, you know, after you've done the low-lying fruit, right, the first 60 horsepower with the intake and the exhaust, we need camshafts. So I got some custom ground camshafts. We'll get into the details of that in a second. And then, if you guys have looked around much at the 2GRs out there, you'll notice that they seem to, you know, logarithmically approach 300, 310 horsepower, and the reason for that, that I found out, is the stock intake. Specifically, it's the part between the throttle body and the plenum, because at about 300 horsepower, you can really start seeing the plenum vacuum really starts to get significant, right? So that means the runners are not exposed to enough air pressure, you're losing volumetric efficiency, and just it all goes to hell. And that's why, all these builds with different cams out there, they always land, 300, 310, 320 wheel horsepower. Well, it's the intake. The intake is just limiting it. The cams are just changing the shape of the curve ahead of that, but in most cases, it's just reducing the curve ahead of that, and then the intake limits it, and it dies. So we've got an intake, and actually other intakes to talk about. But now there's a lot that went into this. Oh, actually, you know what? One more part. I forgot about this part because this is optional, but the build that you saw does use the 2GR-FE high compression pistons. So those are straight from Toyota, right out of the hybrid application, and they bump your compression ratio from 10.8 all the way to 12.5. This motor is very knock resistant, so 12.5 to 1 is still perfectly fine on premium pump gas. For the few of you that are actually interested in buying these parts, there's a link in the description that'll take you to my website with links to all of the parts that you're going to need. On there, I've documented everything to upgrade an MR2 to that, and I've also discussed what it would take to bring a stock 2GR up to that MR2 standard. There's going to be a slight issue with cars that have a hydraulic engine-mounted power steering pump. But that's all discussed there. That's details. We'll get to that. The biggest thing to discuss, obviously, is the brain of the engine, right? This is what does all the timing and sets just the kind of characteristics that the engine will have. The camshafts. So these, if you've looked at aftermarket camshafts for the 2GR, don't look like anything out there. And there's a few reasons for that. I had these custom made. Now, unfortunately, I can't make them in-house, but they're still made custom to my spec. And specifically, the reason I didn't want to just use something off the shelf, there's a few reasons. First of all, the cams are responsible. The 2GR always runs about a 5 to 7% bank imbalance, with the front bank always getting more air, so running leaner. And that took a little bit of figuring out to see what was happening. The heads are actually mirrored, and the rocker geometry, essentially, because the rocker is a roller rocker, which essentially changes pivot based on where you're landing on the camshaft, and it's also really short, it changes, the rocker ratio changes based on where in the travel it is. And since the geometry is mirrored from bank to bank, it means that one bank gets a high ratio rocker when it's opening, and the other bank gets a high ratio rocker when it's closing. There was actually another issue with it that I'm 90% sure was a kind of a late breaking change when they developed the 2GR that they decided never to go back and fix. There's just a timing issue between the banks. It's possible that they did that in order to try to fix the imbalance and failed. I don't think that's what it was, though. I think the valve guide, the chain guides changed, which changed the length of chain between the banks, which changed the timings between the cams. So these cams right here, and the other three, but I don't have them here. What they do, they have, if you look at the profile, focus, come on. If you look at the profile, you may be able to see it's actually asymmetric. It's not because the valve lift is asymmetric, it's because this asymmetric profile is what's needed to result in a symmetric valve motion at the head. And if you look at each cam, you'll notice that the bank 1 and the bank 2 actually have different asymmetry going on, again, to fix that ratio. And then the intake profile and the exhaust profile is actually different. So this cam set, this set of 4 cams, has 4 separate lobe grinds. It took a little bit of doing to get all that done, but they're right here. And the other considerations I did with this is these have more duration and less lift than something that you would normally expect of this power output. The reason for that is right there. The stock pistons, I wanted to be able to reuse the stock pistons. And we have limited valve clearance, so I had to respect that. That also required a bunch of centerline angle changes. In fact, quite a bit. I think there's something like 18 degrees of, on the one side, I think there was 18 degrees changed from the stock position. And the reason for that is normally when you make a cam, you just grow the opening and you grow the closing side and you keep the center line, or you keep the center line rather close. But this motor has VVTi, which means we can get the center lines much closer as the engine is running and get our max power. But then if we optimize for it, like I've done, we'll still have a buttery smooth, low RPM idle. We'll still have power down low and just a very nice wide power band. And then to top it off, I made them hollow. So they save about 1 pound per cam, which nets us a gain of about a 1% weight loss on the engine. So, 4 pounds on the entire car. It's not huge, but it's not insignificant. People do a lot of work to lose 4 pounds on the car. It's also technically rotating weight, but it's the center of the camshaft. That's really not going to affect the moment. It's really not going to affect the moment of inertia of the motor. So, yeah. And that brings us to the intake. This guy. Some of you guys may have seen the previous videos where I had made another intake. I still sell that, but it's about 2.5 inches taller, and it required the rain guard in the MR2 to be modified, and also I don't believe it would fit most OEM 2GR vehicles. So something needed to be done for that. People really didn't like modifying the rain guard. So the big thing I did here is instead of using the, it's right here. Instead of using the factory lower, this little guy, which is a reasonably nice unit, I made an aftermarket one. And by doing that, I was able to increase the port volume, which helps the engine a little bit. It's mostly going to help the engine when we get to 400, 450 and up naturally aspirated. But importantly, do you see the runner that starts here goes all the way to the opposite side? So that's how I got the extra length. I crossed the runners over, and then of course that had implications to other parts. The fuel injectors want to be in line with that, so I had to make fuel injectors that the bores, the bore for the fuel channel and the bores for the injectors is actually misaligned slightly so that it can clear the runners. That's all included as part of the intake, by the way. And since I had to make custom fuel rails, I went ahead and I made them so without a spacer. They support these shorty little Bosch units. This one in particular is a 980cc unit that I really like using in the high power NA builds. But also I supply the intake with a spacer so you can just use the factory injectors and everything just fits there. And of course, there's a lot of Bosch units and other units that are between these two lengths. So if you want to use something else, you may just need a custom spacer, but this intake will do it. And then of course, to continue the length, I went ahead and the runners extend into the plenum a little bit. The plenum that I'm using is made for a large V8. It's the Holley High Ram plenum. So it doesn't matter that this technically loses plenum volume. It's fine. There's still technically more plenum volume than it really should have. And then one last trick I had to do to get this thing down low enough. Let me show you this. So the front intake VVTi solenoid would hit right here when you installed it in the car? Well, I did a little bit of thinking on that, and I realized I can switch the front and the rear solenoids back to back, provide a couple little brackets for that, super simple, and it gives me the clearance I need right here. So the whole thing gets to drop in the valley, no problem. And then the final part of this equation, this one was frustrating. It's the reason that you guys haven't seen a video in a while from me. When I first did the tuning, like all of them, I do my tuning on a Haltech ECU first, because reprogramming the stock ECU takes a little bit. And if I'm paying $125 an hour on the dyno, last thing I want to do is have 5-6 minutes between each attempt. And then also, when you restart the stock ECU, all the learning tables are cleared, and it's not ideal. So I do all the initial tuning on Haltech, which gave me the 350 horsepower tune. In fact, you can see it right here. In that case, it made 348. There was a little bit of timing missing at the top. That's why. And now, if I overlay what on that dyno day, so I brought the stock ECU, I figured out the VVTi, the timing table, all that. I plugged all that stuff in the stock ECU, and I ran it, and this is what it gave. It just completely fell apart. So I had to spend a whole bunch of time on the stock ECU. I had to do a bunch of decompilation and examine the inner workings of the VVTi system. And what I ended up finding is the stock ECU makes a bunch of assumptions about correlations between the intake and the exhaust cams. There's a bunch of things that it doesn't want the intake and the exhaust, depending on the RPM, it doesn't want them any further than X apart. And it's complicated, and I can't even come up with reasons why it's doing half the things that it's doing. So I had to make some changes to essentially allow the stock ECU to run the exact angles that I provided. And once I fixed that, that took several weeks worth of work. We went from that graph right there that you see to, ta-da, 354. Super happy with that. And in fact, if you look at that 354 graph, you can see right at the top, well, first you can see the peak horsepower is at 7,700 RPM. That's not a coincidence, because red line's at 7,800 RPM, and the motor starts doing a soft rev limiter, so it's pulling timing right at 100 RPM before red line. So this power is actually still climbing. If you just fixed the connecting rods and the pistons, you could run, even with these, you could run a couple hundred more RPM, you'd get more power. If you machine the heads for better valve springs, then you could run even more RPM. I don't know exactly until where it's going to climb. Based on all the math, this motor should peak around 8,500 RPM. But again, the whole goal of this was to hit 350 wheel horsepower and to make it as economical as possible, right? If we change the rods and the pistons in order to get a couple extra 100 RPM, that adds a lot of cost. That adds machine work needed. And even then, we still can't go much past 8,500 until we need to start addressing the oil pump. And I do have, well, actually, hold on a second. I actually have a prototype billet aftermarket oil pump for the next high RPM build. This should fix that problem. But again, it's more parts that are needed, more cost. And in this situation, it's not actually going to, that money, the value for the money is not there. There's actually one more thing I did for money also, is these stock injectors, they run out of power, they run out of fuel flow somewhere around 310 wheel horsepower or so. I debated going to bigger injectors, but that becomes a bit of a nightmare because there's so many fake aftermarket injectors out there. Unless I supply the injectors, and I don't have a good way to have a communication with Bosch to buy 20 injectors at a time or even 100 injectors at a time, I don't have a good way to supply the injectors. So what I did instead is we needed about 15% more fuel flow. We bumped the fuel pressure up from 3 bar to 4 bar, and these gave us 15% more fuel flow. Now, as it is, they're sitting at about 90% utilization, which is higher than I'd like, but it's still safe. And one last thing I did when I was inside the ECU modifying all that software is, some of you guys will really appreciate this, I actually found some code in the VVTI where the system, the code was there, but the tune wasn't really using it. The factory camshafts, the phasers, the code has the ability to delay the phasers kind of coming up to speed. So when you hit the pedal all the way down, the phasers wait. I've got it set to about a quarter second before they really fully come online. And that gives you such a smoother throttle application. The 2GR currently is so jumpy, and that fixes all of that. Then the other thing I did is I fixed cruise control. So cruise control now works. As long as you hook up vehicle speed, brake, and the cruise control lever, and you have the transmission in drive. So, well, it has to think the transmission's in drive, so that the D input has to get 12 volts. You will have working cruise control, which super nice. That's something that we haven't had in many years. And then I think there was one more thing. Oh yeah. How could I forget this one? I know how I forgot that. I actually did this a while ago. I just haven't released it yet. Air conditioning. I rewrote the code inside the ECU to disconnect the park input. So the Prindle, right, the range selector on the transmission, park, well, we don't use it. There's nothing connected to it. We just have the thing permanently connected to drive. Park now reroutes inside the system to the CAN message that it used to receive for the AC idle up. So if you put 12 volts on the P pin, you get AC idle up, and you don't need a CAN module, you don't need any of that. Now, to be fair, when you do that, it's expecting a variable displacement AC pump, so it's expecting a soft start. So the engine still stutters just a little bit. I would show you, but my car doesn't have air conditioning right now. It's on the list of things to do. But it still stutters a little bit, but it stutters like 100 or 200 RPM instead of like 300 or 400 RPM. It does a bigger stutter when the AC turns off. It'll actually spike up like 400 or 500 RPM. But previously, when you would engage the AC, you'd get a big drop, and then it would recover some of that, but keep dropped. And some people had AC idles that were down to 500 RPM, where the whole car's kind of shaking, and it's a quality of life thing, right? That doesn't happen anymore. It stutters for a fraction of a second, and it comes right back up to its 650 RPM. Or in the case of these cams, I actually have it idling at 750 RPM. It's just to make it just a little bit nicer. Those changes will be coming to the normal MR2 tune. I've got a few last things to wrap up. It'll be a couple weeks before that's available, but it's going to be available soon. I suspect I'm going to get a lot of your ECUs out there to reflash. I'll be happy to do it. So, yeah. 354 wheel horsepower. And yes, this will work in factory 2GR applications with an asterisk that says with complications if you have an engine-mounted hydraulic power steering pump. I love the exhaust note on this car, so let me just share a flyby with you guys. The only thing I've got left to say is down in the description, there is a link to a Discord server if you guys want to join. A lot of the time between these videos, there's a lot of discussions that go on there about the next videos, about the technical progress and whatnot. So we'd love to see you there if you want to join us. And 20,000, almost 20,000 subscribers. Who knows? Maybe I'll make it to 100,000 at some point and get that plaque. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.